If you love epic poetry but struggle with translations that feel more like museum artifacts than living stories, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be covering Beowulf, a new translation by Maria Dahvana Headley. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at not just a classic piece of literature, basically the earliest real piece of English literature, the epic poem Beowulf. Now, when I cover something like this, there's a lot of different things I'd like to cover. Certainly, I would like to cover the actual summary of the epic poem itself. That's one thing that I'd like to address. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the storyline, the impact of this book throughout history, what exactly the epic poem of Beowulf can tell us, and then also looking at this specific translation. I said the name of the translator. We actually don't know who wrote the poem originally, but as you know, it is written in Old English. So translating it is not just a challenging thing, but it is something that is in many ways making the person that translates it a second author in a lot of respects. And so that is why I wanted to review this book. And because I love history, and as someone that is a medievalist, this is right up my alley. This is actually my second time reading this translation. It's a quick read. And the first time I picked it up was back when it first came out in 2020. I actually first heard about it from the podcast Away with Words. They have a lot of great book suggestions. I try to keep track of all of them. And since then, I've been intrigued by some of the controversies that this book has sparked. Some people love it, some people hate it, and we will certainly discuss why that is. Let's talk a little bit about the origins of the poem itself. As you know, Beowulf is not just an Old English epic poem, it is the quintessential Old English epic poem. And it was composed in the tradition of Germanic heroic legend, consisting of 3,182 alliterative lines, which means there's a lot of repetition of the same sounds. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of the manuscript of Beowulf and how it has come through us throughout the years, just know it is actually one of the oldest surviving stories in the English literary tradition. And the story follows an individual named Beowulf, who is a warrior from Geatland, which would now be in modern-day Sweden. And he sails to Denmark to help King Hrothgar, whose hall, Heorot, is under attack by a monstrous creature named Grendel. Beowulf slays Grendel in an epic battle, but the trouble isn't over, and Grendel's mother comes seeking revenge. If you've read the book Grendel, it's actually told from the perspective of Grendel's mother. Beowulf dives into her underwater lair and kills her as well. He then returns home, he becomes king, and he rules for many years in peace. However, in his old age, he faces one final challenge: a dragon that threatens his people. So Beowulf, in a heroic but an ultimately tragic battle, slays the dragon, but then soon succumbs to his own wounds. His people mourn him, and the poem ends on a somber note reflecting on the nature of heroism and fate. Now, I've now said this like 10 times, but it is one of the most significant works of Old English literature. One, because we actually just don't have all that many examples, and also because it's been so widely translated. It's been well known for centuries now. So the exact date of its composition actually is still uncertain, and you have a lot of debate about exactly when it was written. The manuscript, the single oldest manuscript that we have of it, dates from somewhere between 975 and 1025 AD. So probably, at least based off of the timeline, the manuscript comes after the events of it or its original composition. Probably, but again, there's a lot of debate about that. The poem's anonymous author is simply referred to as the Beowulf poet. We don't exactly know who it was. It is set in 5th and 6th century pagan Scandinavia, and actually some archaeological discoveries in Sweden and Denmark suggest that aspects of the poem may have reflected historical events. One of the things that gives credence to this idea that possibly it was first composed near or around that time period as well. And then it was either just an oral tradition, or we don't have whatever the original manuscripts would have been that it is based off of. So that's one of the pieces of argument. Beowulf itself also contains numerous digressions from the main story, which some early scholars found it a little too distracting, but I would say that modern analysis suggests that it actually enhances the narrative by drawing certain parallels to historical and legendary tales. We'll see a variety of figures that are mentioned that try to, even though this is a very regional event in many regards, it is trying to connect itself to larger cultural movements and an even longer pagan and Christian identity that we see it trying to connect itself to. And these digressions include references to Scandinavian history, as well as to biblical stories and to other heroic traditions. And they provide a sense of historical depth and a technique that is actually later mirrored in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. This is one of the most influential pieces of work on the Lord of the Rings. As a matter of fact, J.R.R. Tolkien has his own translation of Beowulf that is a pretty highly regarded translation of it. Like I've said, the dating of the poem itself is highly debated. Some scholars believe it was probably composed in maybe the 8th century. So again, proximity to the actual purported events, while others argue that it could be from the 11th century, so closer to actual manuscript date. Some suggest the poem evolved from oral tradition, so maybe a little mix of both, while others argue that it was a literary work created by a single author. The reason that would be is just because the actual complexities of the poem and again, all these references suggest that it was not necessarily something that one individual was meant to be able to just pass on to another person, but that it had to actually be written down. Tolkien, just so you know, actually supported the 8th century theory, believing that the poem retained some authentic memories of Anglo-Saxon paganism before England's full Christianization. He was actually an academic specialist about this, so not to just point that out as what some popular author had to say, but that he has some reasonable arguments behind it. But I'm no real expert, so I have no dog in the fight about determining which one it really is. The poem survives in only a single manuscript that is known as the Nowell Codex, and it's actually housed in the British Library, and it was part of the collection of Sir Robert Cotton, but it suffered damage in a 1731 fire, resulting in a loss of some of the text. Not a ton, but there are certainly parts of it where there is a lot of guesswork. I had a history professor that made the joke that, of course, there is plenty of debate over what these missing pieces could be because English scholars need to eat as well. So you can see how that would also contribute to the lore of this poem. The fact that there's still these little elements of history. I wouldn't say that any of the missing stuff dramatically changes our understanding of the poem, but it still certainly makes it something worth digging into. The manuscript actually consists of 2 scribes' works, with one modernizing spellings and the other retaining older dialectical features, again adding to questions about where exactly this would come from. The manuscript consists of 2 scribes' works, one with modernizing spellings and the other retaining older dialectal features. This actually suggests that the text had a complex transmission history across England's dialect regions, and of course this adds to questions about how old the poem itself is and at what point it was actually written down, and again continuing to this ongoing debate. Some scholars see it as a product of oral formulaic tradition similar to Homeric epics, while others argue it was a sophisticated literary composition. And the poem incorporates influences from, like I said, biblical text and Germanic legends, as well as Norse sagas, with possible parallels to some of the most famous works like the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Beowulf's story is also set in a Scandinavian world where historical figures and legendary heroes did coexist. Although Beowulf himself is not mentioned in other sources, many of the poem's figures, such as Hrothgar and Eidgils and Othera, they do appear in Scandinavian traditions, and some scholars believe the poem was composed in East Anglia, influenced by the kingdom's ties to Scandinavian royal lineage. Again, all contributing to these questions of when and where it was written exactly. Beowulf has been widely translated, with early translations appearing in the 19th century and later versions by Seamus Heaney. That's probably one of the more famous ones, at least in recent years. Edwin Morgan and Michael J. Alexander have all gained prominence, and then of course some scholars like J.R.R. Tolkien have explored the challenges of translating Beowulf, emphasizing the difficulty of preserving its alliterative verse. So the fact that there is a specific sound, this repetition of certain letter sounds, that is in the Old English, and so when you try to translate it, if you can't copy that when you are also giving more modern terms, it can really affect the efficacy of this poem and the impact on individuals. So this is one of the biggest challenges that you find. That being said, Beowulf remains a cornerstone of medieval literature. And this blending history and legend and mythology, all in an epic tale of heroism and loyalty and of fate, ultimately. Which brings us to this particular translation by Maria Dahvana Headley. I'm not sure I had read Beowulf before I read this specific translation. I know I had read Grendel and I had read other works that were at least influenced by Beowulf, but this may have been the first time I read Beowulf. I'm not positive, but regardless, I can say that I thought that this was an incredible translation, and it had a lot of things going for it. She is known for her modernizing of the text and her willingness to engage much more in what would classically be referred as the Vulgate or vulgar language, and so not just in terms of something being vulgar now. We think of it being awful and unappealing. But historically, it would have just been a reference to this classical language like Latin or something as it transitioned to a different language, like in the case of Latin, something more like French or Italian. But of course, English, you're generally looking at some kind of Proto-Germanic language that is eventually going to give us English. And so her willingness to engage with that type of vulgar and vulgate language, I think, is something that's really appealing. And then, of course, the efforts at modernizing it. I should also say that if you get a chance, you should absolutely listen to it on tape. J.D. Jackson does a phenomenal job. I don't know anything else he's done, but his reading of Beowulf is really good, so I highly recommend it for that reason. Some of the other translations have tried really hard to retain some of the antiquity and some of the sense of just this long forgotten time period. And so some versions aim for extreme linguistic accuracy, while others try to capture the spirit of the story in more modern language like Headley does here. Headley's translation falls squarely in the latter category. For example, the very opening line gives an immediate sense of what you're in for. She says, "Bro, tell me we still know how to speak of kings." And that bro, that's such a funny term to use. You know, it's usually mocked in modern society when you are talking about someone, and if they would use bro, that's usually making a judgment on them. And in this case, I think it's very deliberate, though, that is the type of culture that she's trying to invoke. If you side with the idea that has a longer oral tradition, then she is invoking that, and she is suggesting that whoever would say bro would match at least a sense of the bro culture, someone that's bragging at, you know, in a bar trying to tell a story. And so that is her starting point. It's bold and it's modern, and it is instantly divisive of the reader. Some people love it, while others feel that it throws away the historic language that gives Beowulf its weight and its gravitas. And there are definitely liberties taken here. It's not a word-for-word translation, but more of a reinterpretation that leans heavily into contemporary phrasing and swagger. But I get why some people are put off by that. I mean, Beowulf is a challenging text, and part of the appeal for many readers is wrestling with the historic language, even in translation. But personally, at least in this case, I don't mind when a text, especially one that has so many existing translations, tries something new. I thought that it was a rewarding effort, and I personally found it very engaging. In a poem like this, where there are a fair amount of digressions, I think it's helpful to have something that is constantly keeping your attention, and her efforts at modernizing it, I think, go a long way in that, because the story itself is not super complicated when it comes to Beowulf, but the digressions do make it much more complicated if you're trying to engage with one of the more traditional translations that, again, tries to adhere a little more to the historic element of the language and not necessarily try to modernize it in the way that she does. I'd say what Headley does exceptionally well is capture that braggadocious, boastful, and that grandiose nature of Beowulf's original oral storytelling tradition. I not only think it's being done well, but I think it's a judgment she makes that, whether I agree with it or not in terms of the actual historicity of Beowulf, I don't know, but I find that it's a very good presentation of it. And the way she writes it is obviously siding with the idea that it's a story meant to be performed, to hype up its audience, to make warriors feel like warriors. That's why it's full of larger-than-life declarations, and this translation embraces that energy with its modern, almost hip-hop or rap-like cadence in just the way that she is presenting this story. And I found the language to be fresh and exciting. And while it's not going to replace Seamus Heaney's or Tolkien's translations for everyone, it adds some valuable to the conversation, I think. I also think this translation highlights an important point. Some books don't need to be translated the same way over and over again. There are already plenty of esoteric, highly academic versions of Beowulf. I appreciate having one that isn't afraid to take risks and make this ancient story feel a little more alive for a modern audience. So who is this for? Well, if you love modernized retellings or appreciate translators taking bold swings, you'll likely enjoy this version of Beowulf. If you really enjoyed last year's highly lauded book, James, a retelling of a classic American story of Huckleberry Finn, then this is probably going to be right up your alley. Additionally, I'd say it's great for readers who have just struggled with older translations, but still want to experience the story in a new and an engaging way. And if you like books that feel alive, like they could be spoken in a crowded hall or over mugs of mead, this translation delivers that vibe. Who is it not for? Well, if you prefer your classic text to remain as historically faithful as possible, this may not be your favorite translation. Some readers will find the contemporary phrasing jarring, even gimmicky at times, and if you're looking for an academic or a poetic take that mirrors the original Old English as closely as possible, there are other translations that might be better fit for you. I must say I really enjoyed Beowulf under translation. Obviously, I read it twice. It's not going to be for everyone, and that's okay with so many translations available. I think there's room for one that leans into modernity and playfulness. And I would say Headley's version won't replace the classics, but it adds to the richness of Beowulf's legacy in an exciting way. And I'd love to see more books with tons of existing translations get this kind of treatment, especially since so many of the translations came out in the 18th and early 19th century, and there was just a blatant stodginess to them, or a deliberate obfuscation of what some of our greatest classical works were actually saying. You can see this in some of the most recent translations of works like Aristophanes, where more modern translations can really affect the way people are engaging with a text that has had a major impact, but there's always room to discuss what should be its continued impact, especially if we are no longer trying to keep it up to date and keep it something that is sparking new interest in younger audiences. And that isn't to say everything should always be gimmicky, but I certainly do think for a text this old and this foundational to our classical literature leaves plenty of room for us to continue the conversation. Speaking of conversations, I would love to know your guys' thought on this translation if you've read it, or if you have a different translation of Beowulf that you are particularly inclined to read or to suggest. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.